This is Audible.
Recorded Books and RB Digital present The Fire from Within by Carlos Castaneda, narrated by Luis Moreno. Foreword. I have written extensive descriptive accounts of my apprentice relationship with a Mexican-Indian sorcerer, Don Juan Matus. Due to the foreignness of the concepts and practices Don Juan wanted me to understand and internalize, I have had no other choice but to render his teachings in the form of a narrative of what happened as it happened. The organization of Don Juan's instruction was predicated on the idea that man has two types of awareness. He labeled them the right side and the left side. He described the first as the state of normal awareness necessary for everyday life. The second, he said, was the mysterious side of man, the state of awareness needed to function as sorcerer and seer. Don Juan divided his instruction accordingly into teachings for the right side and teachings for the left side. He conducted his teachings for the right side when I was in my state of normal awareness, and I have described those teachings in all my accounts. In my state of normal awareness, Don Juan told me that he was a sorcerer. He even introduced me to another sorcerer, Don Genaro Flores. And because of the nature of our association, I logically concluded that they had taken me as their apprentice. That apprenticeship ended with an incomprehensible act that both Don Juan and Don Genaro led me to perform. They made me jump from the top of a flat mountain into an abyss. I have described in one of my accounts what took place on that mountaintop. The last drama of Don Juan's teachings for the right side was played there by Don Juan himself, Don Genaro, two apprentices, Pablito and Nestor, and me. Pablito, Nestor, and I jumped from that mountaintop into an abyss. For years afterward, I thought that just my total trust in Don Juan and Don Genaro had been sufficient to obliterate all my rational fears on facing actual annihilation. I know now that it wasn't so. I know that the secret was in Don Juan's teachings for the left side, and that it took tremendous discipline and perseverance for Don Juan, Don Genaro, and their companions to conduct those teachings. It has taken me nearly 10 years to recollect what exactly took place in his teachings for the left side that led me to be so willing to perform such an incomprehensible act, jumping into an abyss. It was in his teachings for the left side that Don Juan let on what he, Don Genaro, and their companions were really doing to me and who they were. They were not teaching me sorcery, but how to master three aspects of an ancient knowledge they possessed: awareness, stalking, and intent. And they were not sorcerers. They were seers. And Don Juan was not only a seer, but also a Nagual. Don Juan had already explained to me in his teachings for the right side a great deal about the Nagual and about seeing. I had understood seeing to be the capacity of human beings to enlarge their perceptual field until they are capable of assessing not only the outer appearances, but the essence of everything. He had also explained that seers see man as a field of energy, which looks like a luminous egg. The majority of people, he said, have their fields of energy divided into two parts. A few men and women have 4 or sometimes 3 parts. Because these people are more resilient than the average man, they can become Naguals after learning to see. In his teachings for the left side, Don Juan explained to me the intricacies of seeing and of being a Nagual. To be a Nagual, he said, is something more complex and far-reaching than being merely a more resilient man who has learned to see. To be a Nagual entails being a leader, being a teacher, and a guide. As a Nagual, Don Juan was the leader of a group of seers known as the Nagual's Party, which was composed of 8 female seers: Cecilia, Delia, Ermelinda, Carmela, Nelida, Florinda, Zuleika, and Zoila. 3 male seers: Vicente, Silvio Manuel, and Genaro, and 4 couriers or messengers: Emilito, John Tuma, Marta, and Teresa. In addition to leading the Nagual's Party, Don Juan also taught and guided a group of apprentice seers known as the New Nagual's Party. It consisted of 4 young men: Pablito, Nestor, Eligio, and Benigno, along with 5 women: Soledad, La Gorda, Lidia, Josefina, and Rosa. I was the nominal leader of the New Nagual's Party, together with the Nagual woman, Carol. In order for Don Juan to impart to me his teachings for the left side, it was necessary for me to enter into a unique state of perceptual clarity known as heightened awareness. Throughout the years of my association with him, he had me repeatedly shift into such a state by means of a blow that he delivered with the palm of his hand on my upper back. Don Juan explained that in a state of heightened awareness, apprentices can behave almost as naturally as in everyday life, but can bring their minds to focus on anything with uncommon force and clarity. Yet, an inherent quality of heightened awareness is that it is not susceptible to normal recall. What transpires in such a state becomes part of the apprentice's everyday awareness only through a staggering effort of recovery. My interaction with the Nagual's Party was an example of this difficulty of recall. With the exception of Don Genaro, I had contact with them only when I was in a state of heightened awareness. Hence, in my normal everyday life, I could not remember them, not even as vague characters in dreams. The manner in which I met with them every time was almost a ritual. I would drive to Don Genaro's house in a small town in the southern part of Mexico. Don Juan would join us immediately, and the 3 of us would then get busy with Don Juan's teachings for the right side. After that, Don Juan would make me change levels of awareness, and then we would drive to a larger nearby town where he and the other 15 seers were living. Every time I entered into heightened awareness, I could not cease marveling at the difference between my 2 sides. I always felt as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes, as if I had been partially blind before, and now I could see. The freedom, the sheer joy that used to possess me on those occasions cannot be compared with anything else I have ever experienced. Yet at the same time, there was a frightening feeling of sadness and longing that went hand in hand with that freedom and joy. Don Juan had told me that there is no completeness without sadness and longing, for without them there is no sobriety, no kindness. Wisdom without kindness, he said, and knowledge without sobriety are useless. The organization of his teachings for the left side also required that Don Juan, together with some of his fellow seers, explain to me the 3 facets of their knowledge: the mastery of awareness, the mastery of stalking, and the mastery of intent. This work deals with the mastery of awareness, which is part of his total set of teachings for the left side, the set he used in order to prepare me for performing the astonishing act of jumping into an abyss. Due to the fact that the experiences I narrate here took place in heightened awareness, they cannot have the texture of daily life. They are lacking in worldly context, although I have tried my best to supply it without fictionalizing it. In heightened awareness, one is minimally conscious of the surroundings because one's total concentration is taken by the details of the action at hand. In this case, the action at hand was naturally the elucidation of the mastery of awareness. Don Juan understood the mastery of awareness as being the modern-day version of an extremely old tradition, which he called the tradition of the ancient Toltec seers. Although he felt that he was inextricably linked to that old tradition, he considered himself to be one of the seers of a new cycle. When I asked him once what was the essential character of the seers of the new cycle, he said that they are the warriors of total freedom, that they are such masters of awareness, stalking, and intent that they are not caught by death like the rest of mortal men, but choose the moment and the way of their departure from this world. At that moment, they are consumed by a fire from within and vanish from the face of the earth, free, as if they had never existed. Chapter 1. The New Seers. I had arrived in the city of Oaxaca in southern Mexico on my way to the mountains to look for Don Juan. On my way out of town in the early morning, I had the good sense to drive by the main square, and there I found him, sitting on his favorite bench, as if waiting for me to go by. I joined him. He told me that he was in the city on business, that he was staying at a local boarding house, and that I was welcome to stay with him because he had to remain in town for 2 more days. We talked for a while about my activities and problems in the academic world. As was customary with him, he suddenly hit me on my back when I least expected it, and the blow shifted me into a state of heightened awareness. We sat in silence for a very long time. I anxiously waited for him to begin talking, yet when he did, he caught me by surprise.
Ages before the Spaniards came to Mexico, he said, there were extraordinary Toltec seers, men capable of inconceivable deeds. They were the last link in a chain of knowledge that extended over thousands of years. The Toltec seers were extraordinary men, powerful sorcerers, somber, driven men who unraveled mysteries and possessed secret knowledge that they used to influence and victimize people by fixating the awareness of their victims on whatever they chose.
He stopped talking and looked at me intently. I felt that he was waiting for me to ask a question, but I did not know what to ask.
I have to emphasize an important fact, he continued. The fact that those sorcerers knew how to fixate the awareness of their victims. You didn't pick up on that. When I mentioned it, it didn't mean anything to you. That's not surprising. One of the hardest things to acknowledge is that awareness can be manipulated.
I felt confused. I knew that he was leading me toward something. I felt a familiar apprehension, the same feeling I had whenever he began a new round of his teachings. I told him how I felt. He smiled vaguely. Usually when he smiled, he exuded happiness. This time, he was definitely preoccupied. He seemed to consider for a moment whether or not to go on talking. He stared at me intently again, slowly moving his gaze over the entire length of my body. Then, apparently satisfied, he nodded and said that I was ready for my final exercise, something that all warriors go through before considering themselves fit to be on their own. I was more mystified than ever.
We are going to be talking about awareness, he continued. The Toltec seers knew the art of handling awareness. As a matter of fact, they were the supreme masters of that art. When I say that they knew how to fixate the awareness of their victims, I mean that their secret knowledge and secret practices allowed them to pry open the mystery of being aware. Enough of their practices have survived to this day, but fortunately, in a modified form. I say fortunately because those activities, as I will explain, did not lead the ancient Toltec seers to freedom, but to their doom.
Do you know those practices yourself? I asked.
Why, certainly, he replied. There is no way for us not to know those techniques, but that doesn't mean that we practice them ourselves. We have other views. We belong to a new cycle.
But you don't consider yourself a sorcerer, Don Juan, do you? I asked.
No, I don't, he said. I am a warrior who sees. In fact, all of us are los nuevos videntes, the new seers. The old seers were the sorcerers. For the average man, he continued, sorcery is a negative business, but it is fascinating all the same. That's why I encouraged you, in your normal awareness, to think of us as sorcerers. It's advisable to do so. It serves to attract interest. But for us to be sorcerers would be like entering a dead-end street.
I wanted to know what he meant by that, but he refused to talk about it. He said that he would elaborate on the subject as he proceeded with his explanation of awareness. I asked him then about the origin of the Toltec's knowledge.
The way the Toltecs first started on the path of knowledge was by eating power plants, he replied. Whether prompted by curiosity or hunger or error, they ate them. Once the power plants had produced their effects on them, it was only a matter of time before some of them began to analyze their experiences. In my opinion, the first men on the path of knowledge were very daring, but very mistaken.
Isn't all this a conjecture on your part, Don Juan?
No, this is no conjecture of mine. I am a seer, and when I focus my seeing on that time, I know everything that took place.
Can you see the details of things of the past? I asked.
Seeing is a peculiar feeling of knowing, he replied, of knowing something without a shadow of doubt. In this case, I know what those men did, not only because of my seeing, but because we are so closely bound together.
Don Juan explained then that his use of the term Toltec did not correspond to what I understood it to mean. To me, it meant a culture, the Toltec Empire. To him, the term Toltec meant man of knowledge. He said that in the time he was referring to, centuries or perhaps even millennia before the Spanish conquest, all such men of knowledge lived within a vast geographical area, north and south of the Valley of Mexico, and were employed in specific lines of work: curing, bewitching, storytelling, dancing, being an oracle, preparing food and drink. Those lines of work fostered specific wisdom that distinguished them from average men. These Toltecs, moreover, were also people who fitted into the structure of everyday life very much as doctors, artists, teachers, priests, and merchants in our own time do. They practiced their professions under the strict control of organized brotherhoods and became proficient and influential, to such an extent that they even dominated groups of people who lived outside the Toltecs' geographical regions. Don Juan said that after some of these men had finally learned to see, after centuries of dealing with power plants, the most enterprising of them then began to teach other men of knowledge how to see, and that was the beginning of their end. As time passed, the number of seers increased, but their obsession with what they saw, which filled them with reverence and fear, became so intense that they ceased to be men of knowledge. They became extraordinarily proficient in seeing and could exert great control over the strange worlds they were witnessing, but it was to no avail. Seeing had undermined their strength and forced them to be obsessed with what they saw. There were seers, however, who escaped that fate, Don Juan continued. Great men who, in spite of their seeing, never ceased to be men of knowledge. Some of them endeavored to use seeing positively and to teach it to their fellow men. I'm convinced that under their direction, the populations of entire cities went into other worlds and never came back. But the seers who could only see were fiascos, and when the land where they lived was invaded by a conquering people, they were as defenseless as everyone else. Those conquerors, he went on,
took over the Toltec world. They appropriated everything, but they never learned to see. Why do you think they never learned to see? I asked. Because they copied the procedures of the Toltec seers without having the Toltec's inner knowledge. To this day, there are scores of sorcerers all over Mexico, descendants of those conquerors, who follow the Toltec ways but don't know what they're doing or what they're talking about, because they're not seers.
Who were those conquerors, Don Juan?
Other Indians, he said. When the Spaniards came, the old seers had been gone for centuries, but there was a new breed of seers who were starting to secure their place in a new cycle.
What do you mean, a new breed of seers?
After the world of the first Toltecs was destroyed, the surviving seers retreated and began a serious examination of their practices. The first thing they did was to establish stalking, dreaming, and intent as the key procedures, and to de-emphasize the use of power plants. Perhaps that gives us a hint as to what really happened to them with power plants. The new cycle was just beginning to take hold when the Spanish conquerors swept the land. Fortunately, by that time, the new seers were thoroughly prepared to face that danger. They were already consummate practitioners of the art of stalking.
Don Juan said that the subsequent centuries of subjugation provided for these new seers the ideal circumstances in which to perfect their skills. Oddly enough, it was the extreme rigor and coercion of that period that gave them the impetus to refine their new principles. And owing to the fact that they never divulged their activities, they were left alone to map their findings.
Were there a great many new seers during the conquest? I asked. At the beginning, there were. Near the end, there were only a handful. The rest had been exterminated.
What about in our day, Don Juan? I asked.
There are a few. They are scattered all over, you understand.
Do you know them? I asked.
Such a simple question is the hardest one to answer, he replied. There are some we know very well, but they are not exactly like us, because they have concentrated on other specific aspects of knowledge, such as dancing, curing, bewitching, talking, instead of what the new seers recommend, stalking, dreaming, and intent. Those who are exactly like us would not cross our path. The seers who lived during the conquest set it up that way, so as to avoid being exterminated in the confrontation with the Spaniards. Each of those seers founded a lineage, and not all of them had descendants, so the lines are few.
Do you know any who are exactly like us? I asked.
A few, he replied laconically.
I asked him then to give me all the information he could, for I was vitally interested in the topic. To me, it was of crucial importance to know names and addresses for purposes of validation and corroboration. Don Juan did not seem inclined to oblige me.
The new seers went through that bit of corroboration, he said. Half of them left their bones in the corroborating room. So now they are solitary birds. Let's leave it that way. All we can talk about is our line. About that, you and I can say as much as we please.
He explained that all the lines of seers were started at the same time and in the same fashion. Around the end of the 16th century, every Nagual deliberately isolated himself and his group of seers from any overt contact with other seers. The consequence of that drastic segregation, he said, was the formation of the individual lineages. Our lineage consisted of 14 Naguals and 126 seers, he said. Some of those 14 Naguals had as few as 7 seers with them, others had 11, and some up to 15. He told me that his teacher or his benefactor, as he called him, was the Nagual Julian, and the one who came before Julian was the Nagual Elias. I asked him if he knew the names of all 14 Naguals. He named and enumerated them for me so I could learn who they were. He also said that he had personally known the 15 seers who had formed his benefactor's group, and that he had also known his benefactor's teacher, the Nagual Elias, and the 11 seers of his party. Don Juan assured me that our line was quite exceptional because it underwent a drastic change in the year 1723 as a result of an outside influence that came to bear on us and inexorably altered our course. He did not want to discuss the event itself at the moment, but he said that a new beginning is counted from that time, and that the 8 Naguals who have ruled the line since then are considered intrinsically different from the 6 who preceded them. Don Juan must have had business to take care of the next day, for I didn't see him until around noon. In the meantime, 3 of his apprentices had come to town, Pablito, Nestor, and La Gorda. They were shopping for tools and materials for Pablito's carpentry business. I accompanied them and helped them to complete all their errands. Then all of us went back to the boarding house. All 4 of us were sitting around talking when Don Juan came into my room. He announced that we were leaving after lunch, but that before we went to eat, he still had something to discuss with me in private. He wanted the 2 of us to take a stroll around the main square, and then all of us would meet at a restaurant. Pablito and Nestor stood up and said that they had some errands to run before meeting us. La Gorda seemed very displeased. "What are you going to talk about?" she blurted out, but quickly realized her mistake and giggled. Don Juan gave her a strange look, but didn't say anything. Encouraged by his silence, La Gorda proposed that we take her along. She assured us that she wouldn't bother us in the least. "I'm sure you won't bother us," Don Juan said to her, "but I really don't want you to hear anything of what I have to say to him." La Gorda's anger was very obvious. She blushed, and as Don Juan and I walked out of the room, her entire face clouded with anxiety and tension, becoming instantly distorted. Her mouth was open and her lips were dry. La Gorda's mood made me very apprehensive. I felt an actual discomfort. I didn't say anything, but Don Juan seemed to notice my feelings. "You should thank La Gorda day and night," he said all of a sudden. "She's helping you destroy your self-importance. She's the petty tyrant in your life, but you still haven't caught on to that." We strolled around the plaza until all my nervousness had vanished. Then we sat down on his favorite bench again. "The ancient seers were very fortunate indeed," Don Juan began, "because they had plenty of time to learn marvelous things. Let me tell you, they knew wonders that we can't even imagine today." "Who taught them all that?" I asked. "They learned everything by themselves through seeing," he replied. "Most of the things we know in our lineage were figured out by them. The new seers corrected the mistakes of the old seers, but the basis of what we know and do is lost in Toltec time." He explained, "One of the simplest and yet most important findings from the point of view of instruction," he said, "is the knowledge that man has 2 types of awareness. The old seers called them the right and the left side of man. The old seers figured out," he went on, "that the best way to teach their knowledge was to make their apprentices shift to their left side, to a state of heightened awareness. Real learning takes place there. Very young children were given to the old seers as apprentices," Don Juan continued, "so that they wouldn't know any other way of life. Those children, in turn, when they came of age, took other children as apprentices. Imagine the things they must have uncovered in their shifts to the left and to the right, after centuries of that kind of concentration." I remarked how disconcerting those shifts were to me. He said that my experience was similar to his own. His benefactor, the Nagual Julian, had created a profound schism in him by making him shift back and forth from one type of awareness to the other. He said that the clarity and freedom he experienced in heightened awareness were in total contrast to the rationalizations, the defenses, the anger, and the fear of his normal state of awareness. The old seers used to create this polarity to suit their own particular purposes. With it, they forced their apprentices to achieve the concentration needed to learn sorcery techniques, but the new seers, he said, use it to lead their apprentices to the conviction that there are unrealized possibilities in man. The best effort of the new seers, Don Juan continued, is their explanation of the mystery of awareness. They condensed it all into some concepts and actions which are taught while the apprentices are in heightened awareness. He said that the value of the new seer's method of teaching is that it takes advantage of the fact that no one can remember anything that happens while being in a state of heightened awareness. This inability to remember sets up an almost insurmountable barrier for warriors who have to recollect all the instruction given to them if they are to go on. Only after years of struggle and discipline can warriors recollect their instruction. By then, the concepts and the procedures that were taught to them have been internalized and have thus acquired the force the new seers meant them to have. Chapter 2. Petty Tyrants. Don Juan did not discuss the mastery of awareness with me until months later. We were at that time in the house where the Nagual's party lived. "Let's go for a walk," Don Juan said to me, placing his hand on my shoulder. "Or better yet, let's go to the town's square, where there are a lot of people, and sit down and talk." I was surprised when he spoke to me, as I had been in the house for a couple of days then, and he had not said so much as hello. As Don Juan and I were leaving the house, La Gorda intercepted us and demanded that we take her along. She seemed determined not to take no for an answer. Don Juan, in a very stern voice, told her that he had to discuss something in private with me. "You're going to talk about me," La Gorda said, her tone and gestures betraying both suspicion and annoyance. "You're right," Don Juan replied dryly. He moved past her without turning to look at her. I followed him, and we walked in silence to the town's square. When we sat down, I asked him what on earth we would find to discuss about La Gorda. I was still smarting from her look of menace when we left the house. "We have nothing to discuss about La Gorda, or anybody else," he said. "I told her that, just to provoke her enormous self-importance, and it worked. She is furious with us. If I know her, by now she will have talked to herself long enough to have built up her confidence and her righteous indignation at having been refused and made to look like a fool. I wouldn't be surprised if she barges in on us here, at the park bench." "If we're not going to talk about La Gorda, what are we going to discuss?" I asked. "We're going to continue the discussion we started in Oaxaca," he replied. "To understand the explanation of awareness will require your utmost effort and your willingness to shift back and forth between levels of awareness. While we are involved in our discussion, I will demand your total concentration and patience." Half complaining, I told him that he had made me feel very uncomfortable by refusing to talk to me for the past 2 days. He looked at me and arched his brows. A smile played on his lips and vanished. I realized that he was letting me know I was no better than La Gorda. "I was provoking your self-importance," he said with a frown. "Self-importance is our greatest enemy. Think about it. What weakens us is feeling offended by the deeds and misdeeds of our fellow men. Our self-importance requires that we spend most of our lives offended by someone.
The new seers recommended that every effort should be made to eradicate self-importance from the lives of warriors. I have followed that recommendation, and much of my endeavors with you has been geared to show you that without self-importance, we are invulnerable. As I listened, his eyes suddenly became very shiny. I was thinking to myself that he seemed to be on the verge of laughter, and there was no reason for it when I was startled by an abrupt, painful slap on the right side of my face. I jumped from the bench. La Gorda was standing behind me, her hand still raised. Her face was flushed with anger. "Now you can say what you like about me, and with more justification," she shouted. "If you have anything to say, however, say it to my face." Her outburst appeared to have exhausted her, because she sat down on the cement and began to weep. Don Juan was transfixed with inexpressible glee. I was frozen with sheer fury. La Gorda glared at me, and then turned to Don Juan and meekly told him that we had no right to criticize her. Don Juan laughed so hard he doubled over, almost to the ground. He couldn't even speak. He tried 2 or 3 times to say something to me, then finally got up and walked away, his body still shaking with spasms of laughter. I was about to run after him, still glowering at La Gorda. At that moment, I found her despicable, when something extraordinary happened to me. I realized what Don Juan had found so hilarious. La Gorda and I were horrendously alike. Our self-importance was monumental. My surprise and fury at being slapped were just like La Gorda's feelings of anger and suspicion. Don Juan was right. The burden of self-importance is a terrible encumbrance. I ran after him then, elated, the tears flowing down my cheeks. I caught up with him and told him what I had realized. His eyes were shining with mischievousness and delight. "What should I do about La Gorda?" I asked. "Nothing," he replied. "Realizations are always personal." He changed the subject and said that the omens were telling us to continue our discussion back at his house, either in a large room with comfortable chairs or in the back patio, which had a roofed corridor around it. He said that whenever he conducted his explanation inside the house, those 2 areas would be off-limits to everyone else. We went back to the house. Don Juan told everyone what La Gorda had done. The delight all the seers showed in taunting her made La Gorda's position extremely uncomfortable. "Self-importance can't be fought with niceties," Don Juan commented when I expressed my concern about La Gorda. He then asked everyone to leave the room. We sat down, and Don Juan began his explanations. He said that seers, old and new, are divided into 2 categories. The first one is made up of those who are willing to exercise self-restraint and can channel their activities toward pragmatic goals, which would benefit other seers and man in general. The other category consists of those who don't care about self-restraint or about any pragmatic goals. It is the consensus among seers that the latter have failed to resolve the problem of self-importance. "Self-importance is not something simple and naive," he explained. "On the one hand, it is the core of everything that is good in us, and on the other hand, the core of everything that is rotten. To get rid of the self-importance that is rotten requires a masterpiece of strategy. Seers, through the ages, have given the highest praise to those who have accomplished it." I complained that the idea of eradicating self-importance, although very appealing to me at times, was really incomprehensible. I told him that I found his directives for getting rid of it so vague, I couldn't follow them. "I've said to you many times," he said, "that in order to follow the path of knowledge, one has to be very imaginative. You see, in the path of knowledge, nothing is as clear as we'd like it to be."
My discomfort made me argue that his admonitions about self-importance reminded me of Catholic dictums. After a lifetime of being told about the evils of sin, I had become callous.
Warriors fight self-importance as a matter of strategy, not principle, he replied. Your mistake is to understand what I say in terms of morality.
I see you as a highly moral man, Don Juan, I insisted.
You've noticed my impeccability, that's all, he said.
Impeccability, as well as getting rid of self-importance, is too vague a concept to be of any value to me, I remarked. Don Juan choked with laughter, and I challenged him to explain impeccability.
Impeccability is nothing else but the proper use of energy, he said. My statements have no inkling of morality. I've saved energy, and that makes me impeccable. To understand this, you have to save enough energy yourself.
We were quiet for a long time. I wanted to think about what he had said. Suddenly, he started talking again.
Warriors take strategic inventories, he said. They list everything they do. Then they decide which of those things can be changed in order to allow themselves a respite in terms of expending their energy.
I argued that their list would have to include everything under the sun. He patiently answered that the strategic inventory he was talking about covered only behavioral patterns that were not essential to our survival and well-being. I jumped at the opportunity to point out that survival and well-being were categories that could be interpreted in endless ways. Hence, there was no way of agreeing what was or was not essential to survival and well-being. As I kept on talking, I began to lose momentum. Finally, I stopped because I realized the futility of my arguments. Don Juan said then that in the strategic inventories of warriors, self-importance figures as the activity that consumes the greatest amount of energy, hence their effort to eradicate it.
One of the first concerns of warriors is to free that energy in order to face the unknown with it, Don Juan went on. The action of rechanneling that energy is impeccability.
He said that the most effective strategy was worked out by the seers of the conquest, the unquestionable masters of stalking. It consists of 6 elements that interplay with one another. 5 of them are called the attributes of warriorship: control, discipline, forbearance, timing, and will. They pertain to the world of the warrior who is fighting to lose self-importance. The 6th element, which is perhaps the most important of all, pertains to the outside world and is called the petty tyrant. He looked at me as if silently asking me whether or not I had understood. I'm really mystified, I said. You keep on saying that La Gorda is the petty tyrant of my life. Just what is a petty tyrant?
A petty tyrant is a tormentor, he replied. Someone who either holds the power of life and death over warriors or simply annoys them to distraction.
Don Juan had a beaming smile as he spoke to me. He said that the new seers developed their own classification of petty tyrants. Although the concept is one of their most serious and important findings, the new seers had a sense of humor about it. He assured me that there was a tinge of malicious humor in every one of their classifications because humor was the only means of counteracting the compulsion of human awareness to take inventories and to make cumbersome classifications. The new seers, in accordance with their practice, saw fit to head their classification with the primal source of energy, the one and only ruler in the universe, and they called it simply the tyrant. The rest of the despots and authoritarians were found to be, naturally, infinitely below the category of tyrant. Compared to the source of everything, the most fearsome, tyrannical men are buffoons. Consequently, they were classified as petty tyrants, pinches tiranos. He said that there were two subclasses of minor petty tyrants. The first subclass consisted of the petty tyrants who persecute and inflict misery, but without actually causing anybody's death. They were called little petty tyrants, pinches tiranitos. The second consisted of the petty tyrants who are only exasperating and bothersome to no end. They were called small fry petty tyrants, repinches tiranitos, or teensy-weensy petty tyrants, pinches tiranitos chiquititos. I thought his classifications were ludicrous. I was sure that he was improvising the Spanish terms. I asked him if that was so.
Not at all,
he replied with an amused expression.
The new seers were great ones for classifications. Genaro is doubtless one of the greatest. If you'd observe him carefully, you'd realize exactly how the new seers feel about their classifications.
He laughed uproariously at my confusion when I asked him if he was pulling my leg.
I wouldn't dream of doing that,
he said, smiling.
Genaro may do that, but not I, especially when I know how you feel about classifications. It's just that the new seers were terribly irreverent.
He added that the little petty tyrants are further divided into four categories. One that torments with brutality and violence, another that does it by creating unbearable apprehension through deviousness, another which oppresses with sadness, and the last which torments by making warriors rage.
La Gorda is in a class of her own,
he added.
She is an acting, small fry petty tyrant. She annoys you to pieces and makes you rage. She even slaps you. With all that, she is teaching you detachment.
That's not possible, I protested.
You haven't yet put together all the ingredients of the new seer's strategy, he said. Once you do that, you'll know how efficient and clever is the device of using a petty tyrant. I would certainly say that the strategy not only gets rid of self-importance, it also prepares warriors for the final realization that impeccability is the only thing that counts in the path of knowledge.
He said that what the new seers had in mind was a deadly maneuver in which the petty tyrant is like a mountain peak and the attributes of warriorship are like climbers who meet at the summit.
Usually only 4 attributes are played, he went on. The 5th, will, is always saved for an ultimate confrontation when warriors are facing the firing squad, so to speak.
Why is it done that way?
Because will belongs to another sphere, the unknown. The other 4 belong to the known, exactly where the petty tyrants are lodged. In fact, what turns human beings into petty tyrants is precisely the obsessive manipulation of the known.
Don Juan explained that the interplay of all the 5 attributes of warriorship is done only by seers who are also impeccable warriors and have mastery over will. Such an interplay is a supreme maneuver that cannot be performed on the daily human stage.
4 attributes are all that is needed to deal with the worst of petty tyrants, he continued. Provided, of course, that a petty tyrant has been found. As I said, the petty tyrant is the outside element, the one we cannot control, and the element that is perhaps the most important of them all. My benefactor used to say that the warrior who stumbles on a petty tyrant is a lucky one. He meant that you're fortunate if you come upon one in your path, because if you don't, you have to go out and look for one.
He explained that one of the greatest accomplishments of the seers of the conquest was a construct he called the 3-phase progression. By understanding the nature of man, they were able to reach the incontestable conclusion that if seers can hold their own in facing petty tyrants, they can certainly face the unknown with impunity. And then they can even stand the presence of the unknowable.
The average man's reaction is to think that the order of that statement should be reversed, he went on. A seer who can hold his own in the face of the unknown can certainly face petty tyrants. But that's not so. What destroyed the superb seers of ancient times was that assumption. We know better now. We know that nothing can temper the spirit of a warrior as much as the challenge of dealing with impossible people in positions of power. Only under those conditions can warriors acquire the sobriety and serenity to stand the pressure of the unknowable.
I vociferously disagreed with him. I told him that, in my opinion, tyrants can only render their victims helpless or make them as brutal as they themselves are. I pointed out that countless studies had been done on the effects of physical and psychological torture on such victims.
The difference isn't something you just said, he retorted. They are victims, not warriors. Once I felt just as you do. I'll tell you what made me change. But first, let's go back again to what I said about the conquest. The seers of that time couldn't have found a better ground. The Spaniards were the petty tyrants who tested the seers' skills to their limit. After dealing with the conquerors, the seers were capable of facing anything. They were the lucky ones. At that time, there were petty tyrants everywhere. After all those marvelous years of abundance, things changed a great deal. Petty tyrants never again had that scope. It was only during those times that their authority was unlimited. The perfect ingredient for the making of a superb seer is a petty tyrant with unlimited prerogatives. In our times, unfortunately, seers have to go to extremes to find a worthy one. Most of the time, they have to be satisfied with very small fry.
Did you find a petty tyrant yourself, Don Juan?
I was lucky. A king-size one found me. At the time, though, I felt like you. I couldn't consider myself fortunate.
Don Juan said that his ordeal began a few weeks before he met his benefactor. He was barely 20 years old at the time. He had gotten a job at a sugar mill, working as a laborer. He had always been very strong, so it was easy for him to get jobs that required muscle. One day when he was moving some heavy sacks of sugar, a woman came by. She was very well dressed and seemed to be a woman of means. She was perhaps in her 50s, Don Juan said, and very domineering. She looked at Don Juan and then spoke to the foreman and left. Don Juan was then approached by the foreman, who told him that for a fee, he would recommend him for a job in the boss's house. Don Juan told the man that he had no money. The foreman smiled and said not to worry because he would have plenty on payday. He patted Don Juan's back and assured him it was a great honor to work for the boss. Don Juan said that, being a lowly, ignorant Indian living hand-to-mouth, not only did he believe every word, he thought a good fairy had touched him. He promised to pay the foreman anything he wished. The foreman named a large sum, which had to be paid in installments. Immediately thereafter, the foreman himself took Don Juan to the house, which was quite a distance from the town, and left him there with another foreman, a huge, somber, ugly man, who asked a lot of questions. He wanted to know about Don Juan's family. Don Juan answered that he didn't have any. The man was so pleased that he even smiled through his rotten teeth. He promised Don Juan that they would pay him plenty and that he would even be in a position to save money because he didn't have to spend any, for he was going to live and eat in the house. The way the man laughed was terrifying. Don Juan knew that he had to escape immediately. He ran for the gate, but the man cut in front of him with a revolver in his hand. He cocked it and rammed it into Don Juan's stomach. "You're here to work yourself to the bone," he said, "and don't you forget it." He shoved Don Juan around with a billy club. Then he took him to the side of the house, and after observing that he worked his men every day from sunrise to sunset without a break, he put Don Juan to work digging out 2 enormous tree stumps. He also told Don Juan that if he ever tried to escape or went to the authorities, he would shoot him dead, and that if Don Juan should ever get away, he would swear in court that Don Juan had tried to murder the boss. "You'll work here until you die," he said. "Another Indian will get your job then, just as you're taking a dead Indian's place." Don Juan said that the house looked like a fortress, with armed men with machetes everywhere. So he got busy working and tried not to think about his predicament. At the end of the day, the man came back and kicked him all the way to the kitchen because he didn't like the defiant look in Don Juan's eyes. He threatened to cut the tendons of Don Juan's arms if he didn't obey him. In the kitchen, an old woman brought food, but Don Juan was so upset and afraid that he couldn't eat. The old woman advised him to eat as much as he could. He had to be strong, she said, because his work would never end. She warned him that the man who had held his job had died just a day earlier. He was too weak to work and had fallen from a second-story window. Don Juan said that he worked at the boss's place for 3 weeks and that the man bullied him every moment of every day. He made him work under the most dangerous conditions, doing the heaviest work imaginable, under the constant threat of his knife, gun, or billy club. He sent him daily to the stables to clean the stalls while the nervous stallions were in them. At the beginning of every day, Don Juan thought it would be his last one on earth, and surviving meant only that he had to go through the same hell again the next day. What precipitated the end was Don Juan's request to have some time off. The pretext was that he needed to go to town to pay the foreman of the sugar mill the money that he owed him. The other foreman retorted that Don Juan could not stop working, not even for a minute, because he was in debt up to his ears just for the privilege of working there. Don Juan knew that he was done for. He understood the man's maneuvers. Both he and the other foreman were in cahoots to get lowly Indians from the mill, work them to death, and divide their salaries. That realization angered him so intensely that he ran through the kitchen screaming and got inside the main house. The foreman and the other workers were caught totally by surprise. He ran out the front door and almost got away, but the foreman caught up with him on the road and shot him in the chest. He left him for dead. Don Juan said that it was not his destiny to die. His benefactor found him there and tended him until he got well. When I told my benefactor the whole story, Don Juan said, he could hardly contain his excitement. "That foreman is really a prize," my benefactor said. "He is too good to be wasted. Someday, you must go back to that house." He raved about my luck in finding a 1 in a million petty tyrant with almost unlimited power. I thought the old man was nuts. It was years before I fully understood what he was talking about. "That is one of the most horrible stories I have ever heard," I said. "Did you really go back to that house?" "I certainly did, 3 years later. My benefactor was right. A petty tyrant like that one was 1 in a million and couldn't be wasted." "How did you manage to go back?" My benefactor developed a strategy using the 4 attributes of warriorship: control, discipline, forbearance, and timing. Don Juan said that his benefactor, in explaining to him what he had to do to profit from facing that ogre of a man, also told him what the new seers considered to be the 4 steps on the path of knowledge. The first step is the decision to become apprentices. After the apprentices change their views about themselves and the world, they take the second step and become warriors, which is to say, beings capable of the utmost discipline and control over themselves. The third step, after acquiring forbearance and timing, is to become men of knowledge. When men of knowledge learn to see, they have taken the 4th step and have become seers. His benefactor stressed the fact that Don Juan had been on the path of knowledge long enough to have acquired a minimum of the first 2 attributes, control and discipline. Don Juan emphasized that both of these attributes refer to an inner state. A warrior is self-oriented, not in a selfish way, but in the sense of a total and continuous examination of the self. At that time, I was barred from the other two attributes, Don Juan went on. Forbearance and timing are not quite an inner state. They are in the domain of the man of knowledge. My benefactor showed them to me through his strategy. Does this mean that you couldn't have faced the petty tyrant by yourself? I asked. I'm sure that I could have done it myself, although I have always doubted that I would have carried it off with flair and joyfulness. My benefactor was simply enjoying the encounter by directing it. The idea of using a petty tyrant is not only for perfecting the warrior's spirit, but also for enjoyment and happiness. How could anyone enjoy the monster you described? He was nothing in comparison to the real monsters that the new seers faced during the conquest. By all indications, those seers enjoyed themselves blue dealing with them. They proved that even the worst tyrants can bring delight, provided, of course, that one is a warrior. Don Juan explained that the mistake average men make in confronting petty tyrants is not to have a strategy to fall back on. The fatal flaw is that average men take themselves too seriously. Their actions and feelings, as well as those of the petty tyrants, are all important. Warriors, on the other hand, not only have a well-thought-out strategy, but are free from self-importance. What restrains their self-importance is that they have understood that reality is an interpretation we make. That knowledge was the definitive advantage that the new seers had over the simple-minded Spaniards. He said that he became convinced he could defeat the foreman using only the single realization that petty tyrants take themselves with deadly seriousness, while warriors do not. Following his benefactor's strategic plan, therefore, Don Juan got a job in the same sugar mill as before. Nobody remembered that he had worked there in the past. Peons came to that sugar mill and left it without leaving a trace. His benefactor's strategy specified that Don Juan had to be solicitous of whoever came to look for another victim. As it happened, the same woman came and spotted him, as she had done years ago. This time, he was physically even stronger than before. The same routine took place. The strategy, however, called for refusing payment to the foreman from the outset. The man had never been turned down and was taken aback. He threatened to fire Don Juan from the job. Don Juan threatened him back, saying that he would go directly to the lady's house and see her. Don Juan knew that the woman, who was the wife of the owner of the mill, did not know what the two foremen were up to. He told the foreman that he knew where she lived because he had worked in the surrounding fields cutting sugarcane. The man began to haggle, and Don Juan demanded money from him before he would accept going to the lady's house. The foreman gave in and handed him a few bills. Don Juan was perfectly aware that the foreman's acquiescence was just a ruse to get him to go to the house. He himself once again took me to the house, Don Juan said. It was an old hacienda owned by the people of the sugar mill, rich men who either knew what was going on and didn't care, or were too indifferent even to notice. As soon as we got there, I ran into the house to look for the lady. I found her and dropped to my knees and kissed her hand to thank her. The two foremen were livid. The foreman at the house followed the same pattern as before, but I had the proper equipment to deal with him. I had control, discipline, forbearance, and timing. It turned out as my benefactor had planned it. My control made me fulfill the man's most asinine demands. What usually exhausts us in a situation like that is the wear and tear on our self-importance. Any man who has an iota of pride is ripped apart by being made to feel worthless. I gladly did everything he asked of me. I was joyful and strong, and I didn't give a fig about my pride or my fear.
I was there as an impeccable warrior. To tune the spirit when someone is trampling on you is called control.
Don Juan explained that his benefactor's strategy required that instead of feeling sorry for himself, as he had done before, he immediately go to work mapping the man